Hi, my name is Cristina D'Amico, and I work at the Center for Teaching Support and Innovation at the University of Toronto. And that's also where I completed my PhD in the Department of English. And I'm also a recent writer for the Walrus. I just want to thank the folks at the Walrus for, inviting me to participate in this talk tonight. As someone who predominantly works in the humanities, I'm often invited to talk about, books, arts, and culture. But it's really nice to see an organization taking an interdisciplinary approach to, such an important topic like housing. So I'm really happy to be here tonight. I think what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the article that I actually wrote for the Walrus, and then respond more broadly to our theme tonight, this idea of housing for all. So first then onto the article. So the piece that I wrote for the Walrus magazine is looking at the rise of the tiny house movement in Canada and the United States. And for folks who don't know, the tiny house movement is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a group of folks who want to live simply, sustainably, and affordably in extremely small dwellings. I'm talking like 400 square feet, in homes that they have built themselves. And if you were to say, Google it, just to kind of get a shot in your mind of what they look like, I would bet you that the first like 100 to 200 images that you're going to see are going to be of tiny homes pictured in nature, away from the urban and away from other people. So one of the things, if you're wondering about, why tiny homes, what is it about that's compelling about this topic, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my research later on. But in the article, something I really think about is a tension that I saw emerging within this movement. On the one hand, the tiny living movement, it is a social movement. So it's very much invested in scaling itself up and essentially changing the way it is that we live both in Canada and North America. But on the other hand, there's also a profoundly individualist strain in the movement that suggests it's a pretty idiosyncratic way to live, and it's not actually meant for the masses. It's actually something that's maybe only suitable for a particular group of people. So this is a tension I try to tease out a little bit in the article that I wrote. Now, if you're wondering why someone in the humanities is thinking about tiny houses and housing in general, it's partly because in my research, I think a lot about the idea of property, specifically the idea of property owning personhood, which is essentially another way of saying that there is an intimate connection between, what it means to be human and the ability to own things in the world. There's a long liberal history of connecting ownership to an idea of the human. And that's something I explored quite a bit in my research through different authors and philosophers who are thinking about this topic. And one author that I thought about extensively was Henry David Thoreau. He's probably a 19th century American author who's probably most famous for his book Walden, and maybe even more famous for all of the fanfare that goes along with Walden, because in the book he details his leaving home, moving into the woods, building his own house, and living there alone for 2 years. I first read Walden actually was in 2011, so it was about 3 years into the subprime mortgage crisis, and at the time, if you remember, there was just an absolute glut of cultural production around houses, housing crises, banking crisis. That could be an article in and of itself. It could be a book in and of itself. But I was reading Walden at the same time as all of this was transpiring, and the tiny house movement was also really taking off. So all of these pieces were sort of coming together in my mind at the time. And, interestingly for Thoreau, I think folks in general really do deify Thoreau as being this figure of, a great sage of wisdom. But at the time he moved to Walden Pond, he was just a guy in his late 20s who was very disaffected and unhappy with his life, couldn't get a job, didn't want a conventional domestic life, didn't want to get married, and ultimately decided to pursue a radical and very different pathway to find, meaning in his life. And if anyone has read Walden, you'll know that the sentiment of the book is very much, how do you achieve a level of self-actualization and happiness in a world or in a society that seems designed to kind of hamper your autonomy and your freedom? It felt to me very much like an extremely millennial sentiment, you know, all the way back from 1845. Um, but also in thinking about that for Thoreau, that idea of living small and is really attached to an idea of living freely and gaining a measure of freedom through ownership. And that's a sentiment that really does ring true with the folks in the tiny house movement as well. Now, you know, there's nothing particularly wrong per se with this approach or way of living, but I think much like the conventional ways that we think about housing, it does actually leave a lot of people behind. So if you're not resource rich or time rich like Thoreau, and that you can go and, you know, build yourself your own tiny home, this mode of living might not actually be suitable for you. And when thinking about our theme tonight, that idea of housing for all, if, you know, we're going to be invested in, you know, pursuing policy changes around housing, I think most of us would want to do something that would resonate and be impactful for, you know, the greatest number of people. And finally, on that topic of housing for all tonight, when I think of that as a kind of pressing challenge that, you know, we're facing in our current context, I think two broad pillars that we would have to address. And the first thing would be addressing some of those systemic issues that lead to ongoing housing insecurity. The largest one being, you know, wages and cost of living. And then the second point being how we as Canadians are going to, you know, recommit ourselves to our treaty responsibilities to Indigenous peoples in Canada. Because, you know, I don't think you can have a conversation about housing or just housing without, you know, also having a conversation about land and land ownership. So I think that's all I'll say for now. I hope you get a chance to read the article if you too are fascinated by tiny homes, and I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight and to hearing your questions.